And like, I also kind of want to be like, like realistic about what my story actually is, because it took a long ass time to do this.
Yeah.
Like, if you set me down and you were like, it's going to take you 5 years and you're going to be like working a job and you're going to be like kind of like sort of disgruntled at your job and like not finding enough time to work on it, but like squeezing in like maybe 10, 20 hours a week for like years at a time, and then you're going to take a year off and you're going to finish it, I would be like, wow, that just, I get, it sounds right, but like I could also see why people would want to use something like Unity.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Game Engineering Podcast. Today I am joined by Ted, the author of Mooselutions, a Sokoban-type puzzle game where you navigate to the grid trying to get moose in proper places.
When you're starting to make a game, one is presented with many different options, right? I myself was presented with many different options. I was presented with Unity, Godot, Unreal Engine, and I was told by various internet authorities that this was the thing that like one has to do. Like one must, pick a game engine. So if you go on YouTube, if you go on Reddit, or like, basically anything that like the search engine algorithm is putting in front of you, it's saying like, this is kind of how you have to do it. Casey Muratori, however, of course, was the one exception to that rule. And as soon as I found his Handmade Hero series, I was like, this guy knows what he's talking about. Like, I really want to learn more about that. But to preface it, I was interested in making games 10 years ago, and I was trying to do it 10 years ago. And I started by actually using the Unity game engine. And so I had a prototype for this like really horrible, it was an awful game, but I thought it was great. So it was like, I don't know if you want to even go into this, but it was like this, it was this time traveler paradox puzzle game. So it's kind of about like, you're like creating the grandfather paradox, or like you have to like go back in time, but then like make sure that your past self like goes back in time too, to like complete the time loop or whatever. And it seemed like a really cool puzzle game at the time, but then I was like not really much of a game designer back then. So I thought like, wow, science fiction, cool idea. But then it turns out that like as a game, it doesn't work, because there's no choice, right? There's no like you have to do things in a certain sequence, and the sequence is forced, it's contrived, and like, and you don't actually get, so what that, after I was willing to admit that I kind of sucked at game design, I kind of started to learn more about it. We were talking about
how Unity is closed and
right.
how you can't really tell what's happening inside. And I think like it's not only like deliberate, it's as if like even the shader part that you have to interact with, like things like change, it's so obtuse. I don't know enough English words to just say it nicely.
That's a great way. Like, I think that's a good way of putting it. There's so many ways of describing it. Like, I think it lacks a certain kind of procedural quality where I can understand, like, there's basic questions I want answered. Where does my program start? Where does my program end? What is the order in which certain operations are occurring procedurally? Like, I go from here and here and here. There's objects in the scene. What is the order in which the objects are updated? All I see is like all I get access to is this like little tiny like update stub. And it's like, okay, like I have to infer when that gets called. So I can't understand this as a system. And that sucks.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I can just sign off. I actually, because of that, I think I started to learn like C++, OpenGL stuff, and I realized that, for example, an engine in and of itself is a program. Like it's not in a way like I had this because I started in Unity for the game development part. I had this concept that there is a standalone program which is called an engine, and this engine. And there's also the game you're making inside this engine. And this engine at some point like spits out the executable or something, and this is the game, and it's kind of related but not really, and like I don't know where it touches itself, like where's the connection. Also, like this is C#. I was told that the engine in Unity is written in a different language, so how does that work? Like this is not really intuitive and not really like understandable from the developer perspective.
Well, especially if you have some kind of experience as a software engineer, you know, if you have experience or you maybe went to school for it and you studied how to build these things from, you know, just how to make a program, right? And like when you're presented with this, like I'm going to use a compiler to make a program. There's a main function, and like that's the start of my program. And when we get out of that scope, like we're done. You know, it's things like that where for me coming into it, I was like, I have experience with this. And so I'm starting to ask these questions, you know, as I'm using Unity. I'm like, wait a second, I went to school for this. Like, where does this program start? You know, and I was like, wait a second, I went to school for this. Like, what's this doing with memory? Like, I don't know what it's doing with memory at all. It's just like if I make a bunch of objects, I know that there's got to be somewhere in memory where those things live. I know that something's got to be managing this, but I don't have any access to it. And I think, like you, I found this to be inherently not satisfying. I just didn't feel like I was really making a game. It felt like I was doing something else, you know.
So at which point you started to feel like you want to go deeper and start your something from scratch?
Yeah, that's basically what started it. And I wasn't the kind of person that was like, I also heard like these like horror stories too, where I was like, you know, people talking about, well, we had our project in Unity for years and then we just switched it to Unreal. And I'm like, that's so much waste. Like, why are you doing that? Like, why wouldn't you want to just like have the same like build process and, you know, forever? Like, wouldn't you just want to have like why do you want to like lose your work just because you like moved it from one engine to another? And then there's other experiences I had. Like, I think I read at one point, I read the documentation for like Godot, and like it had all this like political stuff in it. And like, I don't care, like you and I are not going to talk politics necessarily, but it's like, come on, like, can you I want to use, like, I'm interested in your product. I'm not interested in your politics. So can you please keep that out of the discussion of your game engine? Like, if you bring up politics in your game engine, I don't want to use your game engine. Like, it's going to make me want to do something else.
Was it
so
in
that was part.
Was it in docs, the documentation?
Yeah, I was in the documentation, and there's just like, I don't want to get into it because if I talk about it, then it's going to make me sound like I like favor a particular point of view, and but what I favor is that we don't bring politics into the discussion of our game engine. Like, let's not do that. Like, thank you. So that's kind of where so like I saw that too, and I was like, culturally, it seems like I disagree too. Like, culturally, it seems like I kind of I want something that's more like, I own this. It's mine. And so then right around that time, that's when I found Casey Meritori's Handmade Hero. And that was a little bit weird for me because I actually started out on a Mac. And so I saw that Casey was like actually doing the thing, right? Like, he's actually making the games from scratch, but he's on Windows, and I don't have a Windows computer. And like, of course I could, I had the means. I could have gone and bought a Windows computer, but I was like, no, like, I'm just gonna, finally, I think it was like maybe a year after like Handmade Hero was introduced to me. This is how long this stuff takes to like percolate in your brain, which kind of makes me sound dumb. It was about a year afterwards where I realized, wait a second, why can't I do what Casey is doing, but on my Mac? Like, what is special about, Windows, or like, what is, necessarily, why can't I do that on my Mac? And so then it dawned on me, and I started to like look for resources for how to do what Casey is doing with Handmade Hero, but if you're starting on a Mac. And of course, not that like didn't exist, right? So like, because Casey promised that there would be a Mac port at some point in time, and there has yet to be. So, and that's fine. Like, it's his prerogative. Like, he's running an educational show, and like, he gets to choose kind of like what to educate people on. But I had this like unmet need, right? And so then I just was like, well, this sounds like a really great learning opportunity. I'll just start building it. And so that's what I did. I started to like make Handmade Hero, but starting like as if you were on a Mac. And of course, I bumbled around and I didn't know anything. And I like, I just made a ton of mistakes. And I eventually got like something that kind of worked. And there, I didn't even know, like at the time, I didn't even know like what a software renderer was and how that was different from a hardware renderer, or like how like, using the GPU versus the CPU. So I didn't know any of this. So here I am thinking like, Casey's software renderer is like the real thing. But, actually like a faster alternative would be to use metal. And so I eventually learned that. And I started to kind of build up a thing on my Mac that I could use to prototype basic games.
Yeah, first you needed to understand how to get the proper information and like where to get the information from, right? Because you're on a different platform and now you're like, you have to understand, okay, so these are the docs and like this is also metal is a equivalent of DirectX on Windows. So you need to switch that and like there will be mostly similar but with the annoying parts. For example, like z axis direction will be flipped or whatever. Like this is
actually
so annoying.
I think they're the same, but I didn't even know that. Like
I know that OpenGL and DirectX has the z direction flipped and it's just so annoying. It's just so annoying. If you want to yeah, and there are some things like that.
Yeah, and you've got to like abstract over that, right? So if you're trying to make a cross-platform game that like supports these different renderers, then you've got to like write the code that like, if we're on this platform, then like let's flip the z-axis. If we're on that one, then let's do, you got to write that and you got to know that. And so basically like one advantage or like one sort of ball that I had in my court when I was learning it was I had experience as an iOS developer. So like that was my job. So I had some familiarity with Apple platforms. But what I would qualify that by saying you can have a job as a senior iOS engineer and really not know shit. Like it's very possible to like not know any of the like lower level internals or like how any of that, like first of all, like a lot of those senior whatever people these days, like they're coming hot onto the job market. Like all they know is like Swift and Swift UI. And so they never had to learn some of the like lower level operating system kind of APIs like Objective-C, C, C++, or how any of that stuff interoperates. And so it really is, it's a completely different education from what you're going to get on a job. Like on a job, it's going to be like, can you fill the table view with a bunch of like, we need stuff from we need stuff in a table view. And like, we need to get some JSON from a server and then put it in a table. And like, that's the, like a senior, like an iOS engineer, like that's the whole job for like 10 years and it like never changes. So you have to realize that, or I had to realize that like what I was exposed to in my job was like completely different from what I needed to know to be able to make a game. And so it's a very different kind of education. You have some like a little bit of like experience with some of those operating system APIs, but you're basically going to have to like re-educate yourself.
So you started from following Casey Muratori Handmade Hero series with the documentation for the Apple platform.
Mac OS. Yeah.
Mac OS. Okay.
Yeah, and I was able to prototype some very like basic looking games. I think the first game that I was able to prototype, like there's all kinds of quote unquote like features that are common in like, I say, a 2D game engine. I started with 2D prototypes because that's like really all I could do. So it was like, I think my very first game, I was able to get like like colored squares. Like, like this white square is the player, and like the yellow square is like, that's like a different kind of tile, and like the blue squares are this other thing, and like the red squares are and so I was able to draw colored squares. That's kind of all that I knew how to do. And so I was just like prototyping like a 2D platformer. It actually had really good physics. It had really good movement controls. It felt good to play. It's just, there was a lot of like features that one would typically expect in that kind of thing. But what was cool is over time, I think, let's see, I took, so another part of my story arc, so to speak, as I became more familiar with Handmade Hero and with Casey Muratori and like Casey's way of doing things, and as I got better, my disaffection with my role as a senior or whatever started to grow. And I started to like become more of a dissident, and I started to like realize that, hey, like all this stuff that people are advocating, really, it's just a bunch of people that like, they don't know what they're talking about, and they're in these roles of authority, and like they lack foundational knowledge, but they're talking about this stuff like with this authoritative voice. And it just kind of got me to where I was like, yes, this pays well, yes, like whatever, it's stable, but like I'm not, like, I've outgrown this is really the best way to look at it. I just outgrew it. And so I think there was just a time like I had to quit my job. It was like inevitable that was coming. And so I tried to at first. So I like took a sabbatical for a year. I like left. And then in that year, my very first kind of like 2D platformer game, I like seriously prototyped that. And then that's when a lot of things started falling into place. So I started to figure out how to do like just simple 2D pixel art graphics, right? I started to figure out like better camera controls. That was actually also the year where I went and I bought all the parts for a gaming PC. It's like a Windows PC. And then I like assembled it. Like I made my gaming computer. And then like for me, like the challenge was in that same year, like, can I also port my game from like, my Mac OS stuff and like make a truly cross-platform thing. And so then that's what I also did. So I figured out, all the same stuff that I was doing on Mac OS, I figured out the Windows equivalent, which was easier because I'll stop.
No. Why it's easier? On Windows?
Well, I think it was easier because I already had the experience from doing the same thing on Mac OS. Okay. Right. So a similar thing. And on top of that, the resources were better. So like learning resources were better. I could actually use Handmade Hero like directly as a resource instead of having to be like, what's the Mac OS equivalent of what Casey's doing here? Yeah. So there was not that. And I had more, like I was starting to like make more friends in these kind of like communities. And like my friends were able to help me out more on Mac or on Windows, because they have a lot more experience there. So the Windows port, like DirectX was actually a lot easier to do just because I had more of a support network there.
I think you in a nice way you've made yourself like a learning path with blocks, right? You started with one thing, with one platform, then you had like a task of going cross-platform, and this is really still not the game that you're making and you want to release. This will be like later, so you're kind of doing like this learning path in a nice way. I'm not sure, was it incidental? Like, do you want it to do this way, or is it like accident? Or
well, I like to think, although I'm probably grossly mistaken in saying it, I like to think that I have like a good business reason for the things that I do. And so if I recall correctly from the time, what I made I decided to do the Windows PC because there was a game that I was prototyping, like my first kind of 2D platformer puzzle game. I was prototyping it, and I had like a playable build of it. I had something like 20 levels or whatever, and I wanted a bunch of people to try it out, and I wanted to get player feedback. But of course, the problem is there's just not as big of an audience for games on Mac platform and Apple platforms as there are on Windows platforms. And so it dawned on me that if I want to have a bunch of people playing my game and trying it out, that I need to be able to make the same game work on Windows. And so I felt like that was driven by a business need. But can I say that like if I didn't have a prototype of a game that I would have wanted to test out, I think I probably would still be on that Mac. So I feel like a lot of the decisions that I make are kind of like, so I would classify myself as like pretty fiscally conservative. I'm almost like I'm very fiscally conservative. And that is how I was able to amass a certain amount of wealth that allowed me to pursue this. And so what I mean by that is like a lot of times I'm not rushing to buy like the latest toy. I'm usually kind of like waiting until there's a really good financial justification for buying like a new piece of equipment or doing anything like that. You know, when I was working, when I had like an actual software job, I was able to save something like save and invest probably 70 to 80% of my income. And so if you do that for like 5 years, just do the math and like, you know where that goes. So I have always, I've been like that for a while. And so I was kind of like waiting for the right moment to like get the gaming PC. But when I did, I went all in. I was like I'm getting like nice graphics card. I'm gonna do it, you know. But I really wanted to make sure there was actually like a business justification for doing it. So
we're in the story where you're switched to Windows on your gaming PC and then you ported the game successfully. And this is also when you made the video about making things from scratch, about this like platformer with the shooting things.
That's the game. That's the game.
Yeah.
So I ended up abandoning that game because it didn't do well in playtest feedback. So I think people would get to about level 7 and then they would stop playing. And I didn't know why, but it kind of gave me this impression that there must be something fundamentally wrong with this design of this game. You know, there's like just something wrong with what this is. And I don't think that I can fix it. I think I need to scrap this game and do something else. I was like really, at that point, I was like reasonably confident that that was the problem. But yeah, that's also around the time that I made that video. I guess we can go into that.
Yeah,
so
let's do.
I made this video called like why you should learn to program the hard way. It's probably one of the things that I am most well known for now. And almost by accident, because like the thing is, I was like, I made that video like 2.5 years ago. So I made that like before my partner and I moved over to Virginia, to Charlottesville. And I made that with that old, like the older game engine that I had that was only working on the Mac. And I think that was maybe the first video that I did where I was like, you know, of course I went and I Googled like, how do I write a successful YouTube video? And they're like, you should make a promise in the first paragraph of the first script. You should promise something that you're going to deliver at the end. And I was like, I can do that. And so and they're like, you should write a script beforehand. And I was like, I can do that. And so I sat down, I actually wrote the script for it, you know, and then I promised something, and I think I delivered on that promise. But what's interesting about that is that video literally sat on YouTube for like 2 years. So, you know, I put that video up, like it got maybe a few comments in the first few days, and I'm thinking, oh, that was cool, you know, whatever, kind of neat. And I was off to doing the next thing, you know, and I'm working on like, you know, prototyping this next game, which we'll talk about. Lo and behold, you know, like last summer in like July, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, like this video just blows up. Like it's getting like, you know, I think at the peak it was like 20,000 views. You know, and not like, I'm not like, you know, there's probably some seasoned like YouTubers like watching this or something. They're going to be like, oh, that's not real numbers. I know that's not real numbers. Like to me, like at the time, like that was like real numbers. I was like, holy shit, like what is going on here? And it was just like comment after comment after comment. I'm like, I can't answer all of this like this. And of course, like if you do anything that like triggers an algorithm, it's going to like bring in a bunch of haters. And so there's all this hate and like, yeah. But there was a lesson actually in that. And that is, it's kind of a lesson for people who are creative, who are interested in doing this kind of thing. Just keep going. Like if you think you know what your thing is going to become, you have no idea. Like there are so many stories of things that were created that were like lost to history and then rediscovered. Like, okay, one of my favorite like pieces of music is like Bach's Brandenburg concertos, right? This thing is like Bach, like back in like the freaking, 1700s, 1721, was like, I'm going to compose a bunch of this music and I'm going to send this off to this well-to-do duke. And it's going to have a very nice, like little note saying, I was so impressed to meet you. And here's some, please excuse how awful this music. I know it might sound so simple to your ears, but please take my music as a kind token. Of course, he's trying to get a job, right? It's like a resume. And, the Duke takes the music and stuffs it in his library somewhere. 100 years go by. And then by chance, we find, these recordings and go listen to it. It's some of it's some of the most exquisite, beautiful, moving music you've ever heard.
How is it called again? How is it called?
The Brandenburg concertos.
The Brandenburg. Okay.
Almost lost to history. And so like, if you think, just because I put something out and like, it's not getting a response right now, or, it's not popular or it's not doing well, like don't feel bad, just keep going. Like, because like you don't know. You have no freaking clue like what's gonna happen. And so now that's also to say, like, you have to understand a signal for what it is as well. Yeah. So if people are sending back a bunch of feedback on your game and they're saying like, I didn't find this interesting, or I got stuck here, or you need to, implement all that. Like, you should listen to people too. But, it's just to say that like, just because something isn't becoming immediately like a huge success or like, insanely popular doesn't mean that you necessarily did something wrong. Like, that happens like a lot.
Okay.
So we're back onto like, oh yeah. So that's that video.
Yeah. And then you kind of parked the platformer part and you started working, or you had a break before?
Yeah. So I decided, and of course, whenever you're about to kill a project of yours or kill a prototype, for me, there was a bit of a grieving process. So there was a bit of, like the 5 stages of grief or whatever. I was like, I've worked so hard on this. Like, I don't want to kill this.
Were you in denial? This is the first part, right?
Of course. Everybody is. That's natural. Like, that should happen. And I was definitely I was in denial. And then, but then eventually I was like, okay, well, there's still a lot of good work that I can reuse here. And it's not all lost. And if I just take some time and go and pursue something else, like just try out a different game concept, I might be able to, use a lot of this anyway. And it doesn't mean that I necessarily have to completely give up on this project. There might be some core ideas or like ideas in this platformer that I may end up using somewhere else in another game. It's just that this particular combination of things in this game, in this genre, in this way, and working. And so it's not like I haven't lost everything here. I've actually built a lot that I can reuse. So I think that's like the positive way to frame it to people who end up having to abandon a project, is like, it's not like you're like nuking the thing to the ground. It's more like you made a pile of stuff and like, some of it you'll use and some of it you won't, but you can't sell this.
How much convincing you needed for like to make sure that you convince yourself that this is okay, because you can take this part and proceed?
Well, it's really good to have a stubborn spouse that's like, you need to make some fucking money. And then when they play it and they're like, this sucks. That helps a lot. Like when you have that, your husband or wife or, my partner, like you have that pressure on you. That's like, yeah, they think it sucks. And I live with this person, like shit, like I better, figure out something. So I think that actually helped out a lot, where he was just like, yeah, this, there's some parts here that are good, but like, it seems like you should be trying something else. And so, that kind of led to the Moose game.
Yeah.
It led to the
tell the pronunciation, the proper one.
I believe the proper pronunciation is Mooselutions.
Okay.
So I know a lot of people say Mooselutions, and like one of my favorite pastimes is watching video recordings of my game where people are like people from like Asia or whatever are like trying to Mooselution, you know. But yeah, it's Mooselutions. The inspiration actually comes from a lot of different things. So back when I met my partner, he had this like kind of obsession with collecting stuffed moose. So this is one of ours. This is Waldo. We've got like 15 of them, or it's a lot of them.
You should point it right at your face because this will be cut. So you don't know.
Point it right at my face.
Right in front of your face. Exactly in the center of the camera. In front of the camera. Yeah.
That is Waldo. You can buy Waldo online at auroragift.com. He is an Aurora moose. So I would buy like these stuffed moose for my partner, like, you know, for birthdays, and like if he was feeling down or something, I would just like buy him a stuffed moose and like hope that everything like, you know, is fine. And that's, you know, that was kind of what we do. But then at one point we were just talking about this, and it kind of, you know, we were just having some conversation. It was like, yeah, you know, the moose gets angry at you and charges or something. And I was like, that's a game. Like that is a game. You know, I can make that a game because it's got all of these kind of like, it's got sort of a lot of state kind of built into it. I didn't really know it at the time because I was still kind of like learning how game design works and all of that. But it's very easy to represent moose on a grid and like trees on a grid. And it's really easy to represent this like state of a moose being angry. It's really easy to represent this state of the moose kind of like charging. It's really easy to put in this like logic of they've got to stop once they hit something. And so like that was kind of this like like I knew that there might be a game there, right? It's like it could work like a game. And then once I you know, abandoned this other prototype of a game, the platformer, I was like, let's try this out. And so there was a game jam. And I was like, I'm just going to do a game jam. And the game jam that I picked was the low res game jam. And the reason I picked it was because I thought that if we take emphasis away from graphics and fidelity, that gives us an opportunity to really focus on gameplay and on communicating gameplay with as little as possible, right? Like what's the smallest amount of graphics that I can use to communicate the gameplay in this game so that I can prototype really effectively? If this is kind of a thing about prototyping, if you're trying to do like really fancy graphics in the prototyping phase, then you're spending all this time, you know, on something that doesn't really affect the gameplay. So really, when you're starting out prototyping, you should be using the simplest kind of graphics. They should barely be readable. You know, they should only like be at a level where it's like barely readable. So this game jam had the nice feature of the entire screen could only be 64 pixels by 64 pixels. And so if I was to like divide that up into a grid for my Moose game, it was something like every sprite could be like 8 pixels by 8 pixels. And so we had to like jam all of that, you know, every concept. And so what I thought was, if I could make this game playable with such few art assets or with so little resolution, fidelity, etc., then imagine what I could do if I had just a little bit more in terms of graphics and resolution. If I had like a 30 by 30, you know. So that's kind of what I got into the prototyping. I was just thinking, let's try this out. It was a 2-week game jam. And so I had 2 weeks to kind of like And I actually had like a friend that was doing the art for it, even though it was like really small art. He was doing the art. And I had another guy that was doing the sound effects. And so I was solely focused on gameplay and programming during that game jam.
You must have been the only participant who made this from scratch, like game jam in C, C++, like raw C++.
100%. And actually, like I remember getting comments on it when I, on the submission, because people would like download and they'd be like, this doesn't look like anything I'm used to, that I'm used to seeing. Like, where's the Unity runtime? And like, it was like, this guy did it for, they're like, whoa. So there's a little bit of that, tech kind of like, whoa. But at the same time, it's also one thing that I try and kind of like hammer into people, like programmers who are like really into programming, and like the thing is, like, customers don't care about that though.
It's nobody cares about your tech.
Yeah, like nobody cares about it. Yeah, and it's like it's a hard thing to like come to grips with and like realize, like, the reason that you do things the way that you do it, the reason that you pick the tech that you pick is it's more about you. It's more about like how you feel about the way that you work, and it's more about like your business decisions. It's not really about them. Like, nobody's going to be impressed that you did your own engine all on its own. Some will. It's not that there won't be, but most customers, most people that are like going to play your game, like, they just want a fun game. And they're not going to ask.
It won't be the deciding factor whether to buy your game or not, whether it was made from scratch or not. It's not.
Yeah. You're not going to have like a screenshot on Steam that's like, and I made this from scratch, and people are, whoa, let's buy. Like, that never happens.
Imagine a tag on the Steam chart, like from scratch, and then you can sort filter all the games just from scratch, and it's like nice plus $5.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm gonna charge more because I made it from scratch. Yeah.
So what happens then? You made a game jam. You made first, let's say, prototype of Mooselutions during the game jam, 2-week game jam, right?
Yeah, and so I just want to like maybe qualify like how rough that was, or like how I guess a few things, like how could you even participate in a game jam with your own engine? So I'll start with that because I think that's like a little bit of context. Like, the way I did it was I knew that the game jam was coming, and I wasn't working a job at the time. And so I basically prepared the project and prepared my like leftover game engine code for this particular game jam. So what I mean by that is I cut out all of the code from the platformer, and I made it so that it was like loading sprite sheets that were only like 8 pixels by 8 pixels. So I kind of like, I baked in a lot of constraints beforehand, and then set myself up to just work within my own constraints. So you can use your own game engine or your own like leftover game code in a game jam. I would just advise you, before you start, kind of like set up your workspace. And that's time that's not exactly like that. They're not going to count that as part of the game jam. You know what I mean? Because you're allowed to use game engines in a game jam, right? So your own engine is just an engine that you're using. So, and you can set that up. But where I think you are judged harshly is when you do like game code before the game jam. So I wouldn't do any of that. I wouldn't do any of the specific rules or any of that kind of stuff. But you can do like a fair amount of kind of prep work before you start, and then that makes it a lot easier. So there's that. But then I would also say that there was just like all kinds of robustness features that my game did not have. There's all kinds of things that you wouldn't have been able to. It was really rough. Like it was just, how quickly can we get the gameplay of this thing like mostly working, even though there's like a ton of different ways that you could, all kinds of buggy behavior, whatever. It's just like, this is a sketch of like what this could be, and then just to see if it goes anywhere. So I finished that in 2 weeks, and I had something like I had like basically the first 8 or 9 puzzles are from that game jam. And a lot of the other content I ended up cutting because it just ended up not being all that interesting. And so throughout this time, I was kind of developing more as a game designer. I was kind of like learning more about what makes for a good puzzle, what doesn't make for a good puzzle. Um, and so I made a lot of levels that I ultimately ended up cutting. And so that's kind of that's where that left at the end of that game jam. And so then
How were the results for the game jam? Like, were you placed?
I wasn't placed very high, actually. So I think that game jams tend to emphasize. I think if you're going into a game jam, first of all, like I think if you're going into a game jam, you got to ask yourself like, what do I want to get out of it, right? And what I wanted to get out of it was like a block of period where I could just a period of time where I could prototype and where I could get some kind of feedback on my prototype. I wasn't necessarily going into it trying to win. Because I think if that's what you're trying to do, then you have a totally different set of constraints, right? So if I was just trying to win, I think I would focus purely on polish. I would have a game that is not that deep, doesn't try to innovate, just is like the most polished version of the thing that fits the constraints. Those usually win. And indeed, that's the game that won that jam was this like golfing game that was very polished, very professional, but it's golf. I mean, we've played golf. We know what golf is. Not necessarily shattering any barriers here. And it's like it's okay. It's just to say that like this is what people want.
Yeah.
And I wanted something where I was like trying to introduce new kinds of gameplay.
Yeah. And this was the basis for your work in general for the Mooselutions. Like you did not scrap that. You just used this project and then iterated on it later on.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people think that or I am told that you're supposed to scrap your prototype and you start over again. And like maybe this is like why people are thrashing from like one engine to another all the time and like but I don't do that actually. Like what I do is I make the shitty prototype and then I gradually morph the turd sandwich into something that like is a fancy like piece of steak or something that you would want to eat. And like people don't necessarily believe that it's possible to do that, but like that's what I did. So
I mean, maybe people say that because if you're a heavy pre-production and you're doing all sorts of prototypes and you change like imagine changing Mooselutions into like RTS and then a little bit of 2D action platformer thing, then it would be different thing.
Are you there?
Yes. It would be a different thing if you were changing genres, going from RTS to some kind of other thing, and then like you would have a lot of leftover stuff that is not really compatible.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, interesting. So I guess like people kind of they don't necessarily like lock the genre in or like the what it's gonna be.
Oh yeah, like I think we can discuss this maybe more in the end in terms of like I wanted to challenge you a little bit on the like from scratch. What is the disadvantages and advantages of
there are
from scratch and engines?
Yeah,
but yeah, the in the pre-production part where you're heavily experimenting, let's say, maybe this is why they're saying they with no
people,
definition
authorities.
with no definition of like they
Yeah.
the internet is saying. Yeah. Okay. So you start then, and then you pretty much start kind of, let's say, production work because you've done your pre-production now, and you have.
Well, I'm going to qualify that a little bit because production to my mind is like you figured out all of what the gameplay is going to be, and now we are about to ship this thing. Like we're going to solve all the other problems. So I kind of entered like after the game jam, I only had like 15 levels, something like that. Like I'm pretty sure like I mean, you can release that. It's a very, very, very small puzzle game, but like you're probably not going to keep people entertained for that long. So my goal was to like make something that where I could like maybe charge some money for it. So I spent a lot of time in what I would call just gameplay prototyping, right? And so all I was trying to do was like figure out what sort of new sets of rules, what sort of new elements could I add into this game that expands the gameplay more, so I could have more puzzles, so that we could kind of carve out the space of like what the gameplay is going to be. So that was kind of the period of time where I was like, okay, well, what if there were pushable blocks, and what if when you're standing in front of this pushable block, the moose can't see you, right? And what if like when the moose hit the pushable block, they stop, right? What kind of possibilities does that allow for? What kind of interesting puzzles might come out of that? So I tried that and I played with it, and indeed I discovered, a handful of like good puzzles that come out of that. And then I kept kind of going with it. I kept kind of thinking, okay, well, what if like the pushable blocks, some of them were cracked and like they blow up or like they explode when hit? What sort of consequences happen from that? What if you hit a moose from the side with another moose? What happens there? And as like, well, he rotates. Okay, well, where does that go? What happens if two moose are facing each other and they get angry? How do we solve that problem? Because like, if they're on even tiles, then they'll smash into each other, and that's fine, and that works. But if there's like one tile between them, now they're like offset by one, and like what the hell? And like, do we allow that state or not? And so like, what's the solution to this problem, right? From a design perspective. And so I decided the right answer was they don't charge each other, because like, for some contrived reason, but like, so you have to like figure out like what the rules are, and then that yields puzzles. So there's like a number of different scenarios or things that kind of pop out of that. And then I thought, wouldn't it be great if like there was a little bit of extra freedom that we could add to the moose? So maybe something where you could push a moose around. And so that's kind of where the cart concept comes from, because I wanted you to be able to more closely control or have a little bit more freedom over where you put the moose. And so that's where we have the carts and the rail carts. The rail carts just seem to be like the best solution to that, or the best way for that to work. And it had this consequence of yielding the game's most interesting puzzles from my, in my opinion. So I was sketching out gameplay for a while and trying to figure, and I tried adding a bunch of different stuff. I tried like rafts. I tried like, I think I tried like exploding blocks. I tried a bunch of stuff that just like didn't go anywhere. And then I eventually kind of, and the last thing that I added in was like moose that like, when they charge, they like flip around. And that yields puzzles. So I got to this point where I got about 50 puzzles that I thought were good, and by good, I sort of mean that they have like a lot of emergent gameplay in them. There are usually some interesting consequence of the rules, and then you design the puzzle around it. And by good, I also mean that when I put the build out in front of playtesters, they came back and they said, we like these puzzles. And so I kept the ones that they liked, and then I got rid of the ones that they didn't like. And I ended up with about 50. And so that's what I would call that the more creative phase.
The pre-production, would you call it?
Yeah, maybe. I think it could be, because the thing is, you can't really put a timeline on it. You can't say like, oh, there's a Jira ticket to make like, 49 puzzles, and like, let's do a ticket for every puzzle, and like, we're going to be done in a month. Right. And like, when the sprint master says the thing, then like, now we're done being creative. Like, it just doesn't work that way. Yeah. So I went through that period of the game's development process, where then I was like, okay, now we've got what I would consider enough to have a good game, a good puzzle game. It's small. It's not a big puzzle game, but it's about like 4 to 8 hours of gameplay. But it's a game. I can sell it, and it would be my first game, which is cool. So like, that's awesome. Like, let's finish it up. And then, now now we're kind of going, like we're entering into what you would call the production phase.
Okay. Well,
right.
Can you tell a little bit more about the time? How much time did it took from the game jam part to get to this stage?
So after the game jam, I got another job for like about a year.
Oh, okay.
And so I was back doing the iOS thing. I was like, how much more money do I have to save before I'm financially independent? And I was like, not have, and like that was a whole conversation. It was like, and my spouse was like, just one more of these, and then like we could be done, I promise. And like, so that's kind of where that went. And so I did that for like about a year. And in my spare time, my copious spare time, I was prototyping the gameplay. So I was working a job and kind of prototyping the gameplay. And then after about that year or so, I was kind of like, I sort of finished the thing that I wanted to finish for my job. Like usually when I take a contract, I although most companies don't like to be like performance oriented or like focus on like actually accomplishing anything, I try to like, call me old fashioned. I try to like set a goal for that company and like accomplish the goal. And then like, if the goal leads for them to like make more money than I cost, then I think that's good for both of us. So I felt like I had accomplished the goal for my client.
How old-fashioned.
Quite old-fashioned, and they made more money on me than I cost, which I think is good, And so then I was like, it's time for me to go. And then right around that time is when, or it might have been like a few months afterwards, a few months after I left, then my YouTube videos started blowing up. And then I was like, oh, okay, I now have an audience. All I got it. And now I'm getting all this like criticism that's like, this guy never finished a game. And like, he'll never do it. And then I was like, fuck you, I'm going to do it. And so
it's called motivation.
It's called motivation. Yeah. So that video blew up, and then I was like, okay, well, it would be like in poor taste if I didn't just like finish my first game and then like show them that I can do the thing, right? And I have these like 49 levels. Like, let's actually enter into the like production phase of this thing, and like let's finish this game. And so that's kind of let's you want to talk about that? You want to talk about like what it takes to actually finish a game, because it is a little bit different.
Let's do like a full story. Let's get to the end of releasing Mooselutions, and then we can come back to all the parts of that we want to come back to, and like lessons learned and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So at that point, I decided it would make a lot of sense to go through a proper marketing cycle, right? So I was also paying attention to a bunch of like, I try and get information from a lot of sources. Obviously my biases are showing, and my references are showing. Like, I have learned a crap ton from Casey Muratori and Jonathan Blow in particular, but I also try and pay attention to like kind of the more business side of things. So I've been reading a lot from Chris Zukowski's How to Market a Game blog. I think there's a lot of like really valuable stuff about kind of how Steam works these days, and what you need to know if you're like marketing something is very different from the development kind of side of things. And so, there's a few like kind of disheartening things that, but what I like about Chris is he will tell you things that you don't like to hear. Yeah. And he's just like, he's very, very nice about it. And like, one of the things that he said that I didn't want to hear was, sorry, man, but like puzzle games, just like, they're not doing it. Like, people don't want them. Like, they don't want them as much as they want like Factorio. And like, he's right. Right. Yeah. And so I already kind of knew going into it that if I'm going to like make my puzzle game and put it out there, that it's not going to have as big of an audience and probably won't make that much money, but I will do it kind of as an exercise in understanding the entire development, or the entire like release cycle of a product. Right. So I'll do it anyway. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to try to market it as I would market my next thing that I think will probably be more successful.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I was doing it. So the first thing, so like all my goals and all the things I was working on was very marketing driven. So I was like, first thing I'm going to do is I need to get a Steam page up, right? And I need to present my game in the best possible light. And that means I need to invest a lot more in the artwork. So I need to hire a capsule artist. So that's the first thing that I did. I hired an illustrator to do the game's capsule.
Yeah, to mention, because some people, listeners might not know this, capsule is this like horizontal image on Steam that shows up.
Yeah.
And, you know, now when I'm doing a lot of research for the game developers that I want to speak to on the show, I now realize this marketing from the other side.
Yes.
Like this is, yes, like the capsule image is like 50% what I will see, right? And this like it's really important. Like I
absolutely. And you as a podcaster, right? If you put like my capsule art as the thumbnail, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But like it makes your work stand out more, and it makes people want to click more on your podcasts. And so that capsule is so important, especially if you're trying to get like streamers or you're trying to get other people to talk about your product. You really want that to stand out because you're helping them. Like if I make a game that helps a podcaster or helps a content creator, like that's that partnership that we're entering into.
Yeah.
So very important.
Yeah. So capsule and what else?
What else? So trailer is obviously very important, but trailers need to show a lot of different things. Like trailers, I think for a first game should show just primarily the gameplay. So no story, none of that. Like no lore, none of that. Just people mostly care about gameplay. So I knew that I needed to have a lot of the game's gameplay in my trailer, and it needed to be very concise, and it needed to also kind of whip through a bunch of different visual themes so that people felt like there is a lot in the game in terms of art. So that's one thing that kind of dawned on me in this production phase was I don't have a lot of art, and I really need to like create a bunch of, at least a few more different themes, aesthetic themes for this game. Because all that I had when I decided to finish it, all I had was the gameplay and the puzzles, which to my mind was really good, but I didn't have the fall theme and the winter theme. So that fall theme I really like because it's got like a lot of the warmer colors, and then the winter theme kind of goes into those cooler colors. And you can do other things like have like a particle effect to add a little bit of extra atmosphere. So those things I think really helped to sell the game, right? And there's small things that you could do that really make people appreciate the thing more as like a work of art. And it's mostly marketing driven. So what I mean by that is if I'm deciding like how many different aesthetic themes should I pick? Well, probably one per screenshot, right? So if I'm going to have like 4 screenshots, then maybe I should have 4 themes, or maybe I think in my case, I did like 3 themes. I did summer, winter, fall, and then I just kind of alternate between them. And so I'm alternating between those in the trailer, and I'm kind of alternating between them in the screenshots as well. And it's just to give people this feeling of like, actually, there's a lot more here than you may think. So that was one of the very first things I really felt was needed was this aesthetic overhaul, this the ability to like have all the same levels, the same puzzles, but in a different kind of aesthetic theme, which to me at that time was actually pretty difficult because I lost communication with my artist. And so, and I had, been like working with various contractors or whatever. And I actually ended up having to learn a lot of like pixel art myself.
You did the art for the final version?
I did the themes.
Okay.
So I took art that I had and I did the different aesthetic themes myself.
Okay, nice.
And I learned all kinds of things about mostly about light and mostly about color palettes in pixel art. But I mean, it could really apply to any kind of artwork. So I was like reading a bunch about it. I was experimenting with it, watching a bunch of videos on it. But essentially, I learned how to create the different themes, right? Well, actually, no, wait. The winter theme I had. So my artist did finish the winter theme, but the fall theme I had to make myself.
Okay.
And so I had to figure out like what are the color combinations that I'm going to want to have, and what do I want to, what kind of feelings do I want to evoke? I want to evoke these like warm colors, and then also how do I like there's certain things that need to if I just took like the player's sprite, for example, the player's sprite in the summer theme is too saturated. And that works really well in the summer theme because the colors are very bright and saturated. But in the winter and fall theme, it doesn't work. The player stands out. He kind of it sort of looks like he's fighting, like he's too vibrant. And so I learned a lot about how to change colors, like hue shift and desaturate and change colors from one kind of visual theme to another. And really what that is it's kind of like simulating like different lighting conditions, basically. So I want the player to still look like the player, but in the fall theme.
What resources have you used for this YouTube videos mostly?
Mostly YouTube videos, yeah, from what's his name? Brandon James Greer has a really
Oh
great
yeah.
YouTube
Oh yeah.
channel.
Yeah.
Yeah, people in the audience are probably familiar. But like this concept of hue shifting, I think is like very important if you're trying to figure out your color palette in pixel art or in any kind of like two-dimensional art, really. So I tried that out, and I finally got to and I'm using A Sprite, so I'm like learning all about how to construct a color palette, how to take a really large color palette and maybe simplify it down to like the essentials so that your art has more of a distinctive character to it. And so I finally kind of got to a place where I felt like I had those three themes like really nailed. And when I did that, then of course I updated my Steam page and I updated the trailer, and I made my Steam page look as good as it possibly could. And then and then I mean you'll notice like one thing that like is strange to me is how people will talk about, they're like, I don't know how my game's going to do if I release it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Of course you know. Like put up a page, put up your stuff, and then like look at the wish lists and like look at the traffic. Why do you think it's going to like do any differently when it
Yes.
releases than how it's doing before? You know,
Yes.
like
You can even take a percentage, let's say like 15 or 20% of the wish lists and see them as purchases after you release it, right? Like if anything, if nothing major happens, this will be your reality, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one thing too, we'll talk about this, but like, I'm going to say that with a caveat that we'll get back to later, because there are things that do happen around the launch that like you'll have to know about, and they're great for you. Like it's a huge promotional boost to launch a game, but like we'll talk about that later. So I'm kind of everything that I'm doing is no longer like development focused when I'm in that production phase. It's mostly marketing focused. It's mostly like the things that I'm putting in the game, I'm putting in there because I believe it will make it more marketable. And so it's the different aesthetic themes. It's the particle effects. It's certain animations, certain sound effects, all of it. Achievements. So I came up with a list of about 5 or 6 different things that I felt were absolutely necessary from a marketing perspective to finish before I properly launched that on Steam. And then the production phase was basically just doing all those things. And then once they were done, I could actually ship it. And I think the production phase was something like, I think I started that phase probably in July of last year. And then I ended that phase in December. So about like 6 months or so of just tightening the bolts and like finishing everything.
So
and then like launching it.
Game jam, 2 weeks, then a year-long, let's say, pre-production, actual development, kind of.
While I'm working a job.
Yeah, so it's part-time, and then half a year full-time development, kind of for the marketing also purposes, like production part. Then I would say you had an amazing score in terms of being quick, right?
Did I don't know.
I would say so. Yeah.
The thing about it is, it's not really about working hard. It's about, I do work hard. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I put in a lot of time and I put in a lot of effort, or as much time as I can. But like, I'm kind of older. Like, I'm 40, and not to mention, like, while I was in production phase, I got diagnosed with a heart problem, and I ended up having to get heart surgery and like all this other stuff. So, like, life is going on too, and life is always going on, and like that's just kind of the thing.
Yeah.
So.
What happened? What happened then on the launch? You mentioned that you want to talk about like promotional boost in terms of the launch and things like that.
Yeah. So I had one thing also is like I was not scrambling at the end of this. Like by the time I decided to set a release date, I already had a working build like on Steam that I could like click a button and be like, let's deploy this. And it was mostly good. Like there were things that were not, some like not all of the polishes in there. There's still problems, but I had what I would consider like something I could release. And it was ready to go. And that's when I set the release date. It was like, this is going to be a time when I know that I will be able to field questions and QA and actually support the product before I release it. But yes, when you actually release a game, this is after it's gained all these wish lists, and it's after it's already kind of got an audience. Releasing a game from the perspective of Steam is a big promotional boost. It's huge, actually. So maybe I can share my screen, actually, and I can show my graph.
You can send me, I think you can send me later on, and I will put this in.
Yeah, later on. Okay, yeah, I'll actually send you the graph. But basically, there's like, Steam's not promoting you. 3 days before your launch, it goes way up. And then it goes down, and then there's this like long tail where the discovery queue is promoting you.
Yeah.
And the discovery queue will promote you for like about a month. And now I'm still in that like long tail discovery queue is promoting me phase.
Have you sent the game to streamers/YouTubers to promote?
Yeah, I have. I mean, to the degree that's useful. Puzzle games, again, there's a reason that Chris Zukowski sort of like recommends against puzzle games is like they are hard to stream. So streamers tend not to like puzzle games because they get stuck. And then they like, how much do you like to be like the guy I'm streaming? Like you're kind of expected to be entertaining people. You're expected to be saying things. And you're just like, oh, I'm really stuck. And like, if I devote my mental energy to talking, then I'm not going to solve my puzzle. And if I devote my mental energy to solving the puzzle, then I'm not going to be able to talk. So it's like this like shitty position to be in. So they don't like it. But there are some people that do stream puzzle games for sure. Like it does happen.
Okay. And then you launched, and then you also engaged in the cross-platform work and porting the game, right?
Yeah, so I launched the game, and there was I got a bunch of feedback afterwards, basically, that I tried to address in the first few weeks. So anytime, I think people worry about, there's like this perfectionist tendency where people are like, oh my God, like, I can't release something with bugs in it. And like, I'm not above that. Like, or I'm not like that guy that's going to be like, my products are so good, and I'm such a good developer. No, like, here's the thing. When you put something out, okay, you're going from a very small audience, which is like you and your friends and you're like their playtesters, and then it's going to a much bigger audience. What that means is like that bigger audience is going to find shit. And like, they're going to find a lot of shit. And that's okay. Because like a lot of them will send you the reports and then you'll be able to fix it. So thankfully for my case, it wasn't that much stuff that was bad. And actually most of the stuff that was bad that I had to fix was more like design problems. Like the menus were kind of messed up and like didn't really work well. And I like a lot of it's like people would send me design feedback and I'd be like, yeah, I agree. Like that sucks. Like you're right. Like, that menu could have been better. And like, yeah, I mean, I wasn't putting a ton of effort into the menu because like I was trying to like get the game out. But you're right, and I'll make the menus better. And like I think I didn't have audio controls, which like people expect that kind of thing. Like people should be able to change the volume. They should be able to change like the music and the sound. They should change that. Like so, I put that in. Like all those kinds of things I did, and then actually the game itself launched on both Mac OS and Windows at the same time. So on Steam. So I had the game running on both those platforms at the same time, because I had just kind of always been doing that. Because like, the story that I told you earlier, I started off on a Mac and I just kind of always kept my Mac thing going while I had the Windows thing. So that's just something I do now. I just always, every game I make, I put out a Mac version too, just because it's kind of in my heritage now. So I just do that. And so that launched that way. But yeah, there was also porting to, so there's some like different things you got to do to get a game on Steam versus get it on like the Mac App Store. So I wanted the game to also be on the Mac App Store. So I spent a little bit of time building it, like kind of going over my build system so it could spit out something that Apple would accept.
And accepting the documents on their pages and things like that, like licensing and like,
yeah.
Oh yes, I understand. Oh yes, this game is okay for these people and this game is not okay for these sets of people, and this contains and that, and things like that.
Apple's pretty onerous with their terms.
Yeah.
Like well, the thing that sucks about Apple is they really want you to buy into using Xcode as the build system.
Yes.
And like everybody does that. And so like if you're like, I'm going to be the guy that doesn't do that, they're not really your friend.
Yeah.
So my build system does not really it relies on the Xcode tool chain. It does not rely on Xcode projects or like Xcode build schemes or any of that stuff. And so I found myself kind of bumping up against a lot of walls in the process of doing this. In the process of trying to submit that build, it was like, oh, there's like a plist key that like doesn't match a thing that Apple expects. And like that, the presence of this key got their system to like go down this like wild goose chase. And now it thinks that there's something wrong with my icon, but there's actually nothing wrong with my icon. It's just that I put this plist key in here. And if I remove the key, then like they don't complain. So it's like a lot of these like hidden bugs and errors and like stuff that they complain about that you just got to kind of know is a thing. And then, after about, I think it was like, I was tweeting about this like the whole time for like a week. I was like, I am still in Apple guessing hell. It was just like a week of like, yep, another day of Apple guessing. Here we are, we're Apple guessing.
Okay.
So
let's turn to the more retrospective area.
Sure.
So you've spent quite some time on learning things from scratch, to how to build games from scratch, and then making Mooselutions. Do you think that, first of all, you would have easier time doing this with an engine, or it's just that now when you've learned this stuff, it's as easy as using the engine?
Yeah, so that's basically the way I look at it. And like my argument is, I don't know if you watched much Seinfeld, but it's kind of like serenity now and sanity later is sort of what I feel game engines are, right? So you get the serenity now of it does all this like hard stuff for you. You don't have to learn the like really hard stuff right away. It just kind of works right away for you. But the insanity later part is when you're trying to finish a game, when you need that precision, that level of detail, that control that usually comes with properly finishing a product. And so what I found was all I did was I had insanity now, serenity later. So that's kind of like learning how to do it was insane. It was so difficult for like a long time and very unrewarding. Well, I don't know. I think like the journey is its own reward, but not financially rewarding for sure. And like you got to kind of be sort of like the person that like you got to be kind of like how you got to have my temperament to want to do something like that in the way that I did it. But yeah, learning all of that stuff, building up the fundamentals, saying like, gosh, this is so hard. I don't know how any of this works. I'm so frustrated. But then what I found was at the very end of the project, when I wanted something to behave just so, I could make that happen. And it was not this hair-raising experience of like, how does this object talk to that object? In what order do things get called in? And like, I could very cleanly reason about my systems because everything that I do is just procedural. It's just, like lines of logic, and this thing happens, and then that thing happens. I know like where the program starts. I know where it ends. I know how much memory it's using. I know how to debug it. So there's nothing that's like happening that I can't very easily reason about. And so what I find is that towards the very end of projects, it makes it much easier to do.
You've mentioned that you didn't get a lot of issues regarding the logic in the game, like in the bugs reports and things like that, like reviews. So,
correct.
And if you did, then you could have them fixed quite easily, right? Like,
yeah, and actually, because I had total control over the state of the game, you could say, my game explicitly uses a state machine kind of system that I set up. So every move in the game goes through this like separate kind of state machine system. You can't make a move in the game unless like my state machine like validates, like ensures that the move is valid, and then like spits out the next like configuration on the board, and like the next, like, here's where everybody's going, and like here's all the animations that are going to happen. And so I was able to very cleanly lock all of that down. I think because I have precise control over all of it. I know where all this stuff lives in memory. I know I know all of it. And so I think you're going to fight no matter what, basically. Like, you're going to pay no matter what. The question is, how are you going to pay, right? And I guess this puts me, like I said earlier, I'm much more fiscally conservative. So I just think that life just is kind of shitty when you don't have much money. So like the way to solve that is to like get the money and like start saving it and like start putting yourself into a position of power. And like life sucks when like you don't have a game engine. Like, you don't have a game engine. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you got to like, you could make one and then eventually get to a point where you've got like a more robust tool set, right? Or you could like become a tenant in someone else's apartment building and have them dictate the terms to you. Like, life just sucks when you don't have a game engine. And so I've kind of always been about putting in the work up front and investing, and then knowing that you will get a return at some point down the road for all that hard work. And that applies to so many other dimensions in life. It really does. It applies to your health. It applies to your relationships. So I guess if there's any criticism of me that could be made that I think is the most valid is like, well, what if you have a heart problem at 40 and like you die in the operating room, and like that almost happened? There was a 0 point, what was it? My nurse told me that there was like a 0.02% chance. So it's basically like when I went in to get my valve repaired, there was like, I was like rolling a 5,000 sided dice, and like on one of those faces, like I die, right? And like, now, the argument here is like, is this kind of thing? Yeah. So like in a number of different Monte Carlo simulations of various lives, there's a life where you made your game engine and you like were just on the cusp of releasing your game, and then you went in for a heart procedure and died. And like, I guess the question that you have to ask yourself is like, do you accept that reality? Do you accept that you could be living in that reality?
Yeah, I don't think that's a strong argument against learning things, how things work from scratch, and pretty much investing in the future. Like, you can die tomorrow. Like, if that turns off like all the learning part and all the things that you can do in 10 days, this reality that you can die tomorrow. I think that's
Well, it's for me, I thought a lot about this because I actually was faced, uh, and I thought I've really enjoyed this process. Like I
yeah.
enjoyed the whole thing, actually. Like regardless of whether the game itself becomes a success or I ever end up making something that makes a lot of money, I enjoy really learning things. Like this is me. Like this is what I want to do. And I can't countenance working with a bunch of systems that I don't understand. It's just not me. And and I think like that's kind of the end of the discussion, really. Is like you're like ultimately what you're saying is like this is what I value, and I don't value the other stuff. Like I value understanding the tools that I'm working with. I value satisfaction in my work. I value control, over my business and over the products that I make. This is what I value. And I don't have to be successful to have those values. Like that doesn't have to lead to something successful. I can just enjoy what I'm doing, knowing that I'm living my life according to my own values.
You mentioned learning. I think that Lucas Pope, the author of Papers, Please and Return of the Obra Dinn, Lucas Pope, and now is making his third major game, I think, and he has like a huge blog post exploring him and trying to let's say, describing his journey into how audio works, like in general audio works, how audio digitalized works, and he sums it up like, I've put so much time into this. This wasn't really rewarding. But learning about this stuff is just the sole reason I'm making games anyway. so I don't find it like a waste of time. It's just that it didn't came up. Like it wasn't I didn't have a built product after this time of research how audio works. But it's funny that like the incentives and like why people tend to do this, it's usually around the same set of kind of values or like ways of thinking, right?
Yeah. I think ultimately all we have is a value argument. It's not really even an argument, right?
Yeah.
Like if somebody said like, in the short term, if you use a game engine, you will make more money. I would be like, yeah, that's true. Right. Like even with like Unity's like crazy, like rent seeking, even with all of that, like they're probably right. Because it really like the way I knowing, like I know this because I put out apps and I put out games and I ask for money for them. And if I can increase the rate at which I do that, then I make more money. We're making this podcast. You don't get paid until you release, podcasts. Like that's how you get paid. And similarly, I know like I didn't get paid until that YouTube video did really well. I don't get paid. I actually just got my first payment for Mooselutions from Valve like a few days ago.
Okay.
Like if I didn't release the game, I wouldn't got. So if I could have released it faster, if I could have taken a shortcut, of course I would have made more money faster.
Yeah.
I
also find your like we talked before this episode, we talked about how you see making games like without even engines, right? Like making games from scratch, like not making an engine and then making a game. It's just making a game, but from scratch without this kind of intermediate layer, like thinking about the game as a itself, like a software itself. I find this quite compelling. Like don't think of a game engine as a tool that you're making. Just make the game. Make the game that you want. And
and like the engine is just and I think this is kind of playing my Super Nintendo, whatever. This is how they made games. Like they're like, we're gonna make Super Mario World. And like they sat down and they were like, it's gotta, we gotta have these worlds and we're gonna play around with like this kind of jumping mechanic. And what new things can we do on the Super Nintendo? And they're just trying to make that game. And then in the process of making that game, they end up making all these systems and all this code. And there's all this like stuff that's like left over after they made the game, right? And they made a bunch of games in the 90s. And in the course of making all those games, there was stuff left over that they ended up using on their next project. And then gradually over time, that sort of like stuff that was left over ended up becoming game engine companies. And it ended up becoming game engines. That's the case actually with the Unreal Engine. You know, Tim Sweeney was like a college student making a bunch of games in like the, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And they made like a bunch of different 3D games, made a bunch of different 2D games. A few of them became popular. And then they had this like leftover code that they ended up selling to other game companies that wanted to use it to make their own games. And then that's how kind of like this idea of people using game engines even became a thing. It's just started with people making games. So one way I like to think of it is really a game engine is just, it's your Thanksgiving leftovers. That's all it is like you made a Thanksgiving dinner. Everybody enjoyed it. They all had a good time. We like laughed it up. And like now there's some stuff in the fridge you can use for another meal.
The analogy is only for the US people, but I get that.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. With some other, like, you know, maybe your Christmas dinner, maybe that's like your Chinese New Year's. Like either way, you know,
okay.
we could internationalize the discussion. And indeed, for me, it was actually the case that you know, I talk about that 2D platformer that I ended up abandoning. Well, I also ended up reusing a ton of code from that game, like pretty much all of the platform layer, all that stuff, like the memory allocation, like sound, a ton of different stuff I ended up reusing in Mooselutions. So when you abandon a project, you think that like I'm failing, like, you know, what a waste. But actually, you have a thing, you've got some leftovers that you can use for your next thing. So just like go make the next thing.
How would you recommend? Imagine that there's listening somebody and would like to follow your path. How would you make this path easy for him? Like where to start to learn all these arcane stuff?
To actually, well, there's more resources now than there was when I started. And really? I think that there's even more of a community now than there was when I started. So I think you're more able to, you know, I can sort of throw out the obvious things. I could throw out like Handmade Hero, I think is great. I even have some of my own like very crappy like Mac OS resources that are like super old and back when I was like very inexperienced. But there's more people now kind of talking about this than there was, say, even 10 years ago. I think we're actually in a little bit of a culture shift in terms of like software. I actually think that there are more, and the reason I say this, I think there's more influencers now who do take this more old school approach, who are becoming more popular, and that is kind of slowly nudging the culture in a different direction. Primogen, for example, I think is one of those influencers that is very popular, has a lot of content. It's kind of starting to get more of the mainstream folks thinking more in this way. So I think you're better off now than you were. But yeah, I basically used Handmade Hero as a reference. So I did about the first 60 or so days of it and then kind of branched off and did my own thing. But also recognize that like there are just, it sucks. Like it's kind of, this is like, it's like wealth building. So the analogy I'm going to say is like, this is something like any financial advisor will tell you. For me, saving my first $100,000, saving and investing it, that was the hardest amount of money to invest, right? Because the effects of compounding are not present yet. You're not starting to get those big returns yet. So, and you're putting in all this money and you're not really seeing it grow, right? But once you hit that $100,000 invested, then all of a sudden you are starting to see the effects of compound interest working. And all of a sudden, like Like it was much easier for me to get from 100,000 to 200,000 than it was for me to get from 0 to 100,000.
Oh yeah.
And then similarly from 300,000 to 400,000. So what I would say is like investing is painful. That's why a lot of people don't do it, right? And it's the same thing with your health. It's the same thing with your relationships. Investing in exercise and good health and eating, it's painful at first because like I got to do this, like this hurts, and cooking, like I don't even know how to cook any of this stuff, and I'm so used to just like microwaving my meals, and like I got to learn all this stuff. Like that's kind of the nature of it. Is like it should suck when you're beginning, and you just have to stick with it for like a long time before you start to notice the effects of compounding. So I think like with games in particular, if you can get to a point where you've launched like one game, then I think the next game is going to be that much easier. And the game after that's going to be much easier. And on top of that, the second game, you're going to have an even bigger audience because you'll be able to use the audience from your first one. And the third game, you'll have an even bigger audience. So it's investing. I think if you get comfortable with the fact that investing is supposed to feel this way, it's okay.
And you have the leftovers from your the games that you've made before. You have the leftovers game engines, Thanksgiving leftovers that you can reuse from and readapt to new situations. And
you never know.
And if you manage to do things in a modular way in terms of like programming and code wise, you can actually take the whole modules, replug them to a new project, and you're kickstarted. And if you do this with an engine, it's not the same. Like you're not owning this engine, so you can't.
Well, they'll update it, and now all this stuff won't work the same way.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and it's so great that you pointed that out, because I found myself very frequently while I was making Mooselutions, the first game that I made that's like making money. I went back to my old projects all the time. And I would nick like a function here, or like a piece of code there, or like, something from there was actually a period of time where I prototyped a 3D game for like a month or so just to learn 3D. And I ended up using a bunch of stuff there. That's how there's like sprite rotation in Mooselutions. So you may think that you're failing, because you finished this prototype and the gameplay didn't go in a direction that you like. But actually, now you have something that you can use. You'll probably pull some code from that later on.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered it, didn't we?
I think that was excellent.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for appearing on the show and discussing Mooselutions. It was really nice.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Can you tell me where people can follow you if they want to?
So I would say the best place to follow me would be like on Steam, because that's where my games are actually coming out. There'll probably be a link for Mooselutions in the description, but also I do have a YouTube channel. That's where that like notorious or perhaps somewhat famous "Why You Should Learn to Program the Hard Way" video. So I do videos. I like to say that I'm kind of like a mattress salesman, which is to say that like, whenever I do a video, it's always like I'm trying to like push a game too. So I'll like the video it'll be about a topic that's related to the game, but really I'm trying to get you to like go to my games. So I do talk about a lot of stuff that's like related to game development and game design, and you'll find that on my YouTube channel. But please, try the games. That's what I really want to be doing that more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah. Great talking.